defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There's some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC. A boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I'm so excited to have you. Thank you again for joining me on this journey, as you do every week. You guys are an incredible audience. Thanks to you, I have gotten the award for the most innovative show, and so it's thanks to the listeners like you who tune in every week and listen to me. You DM me, you tweet me, you send me emails on my website. I don't even know how you even find half the emails that are out there. I can't believe I even have some of those emails still going, but thank you so much for your engagement. It means a lot to me. Shout out to everyone who I had the chance to interact with in Los Angeles last week. Thank you for coming up to me. It was great to see you. And so let's just keep the conversation going and keep the good times going. I have with me a fantastic three guests who will be joining us today to really round out the conversation about policing, police dynamics, police community relations, all the things that were happening right now in America is really beginning to take root and take shape into the national discourse and conversation. Now we're seeing it through the lens of policy. But there is a film, ladies and gentlemen, a film that is coming out this Friday called The Hate You Give that really puts a human touch and a human narrative to the police dynamics that we're seeing across America. And it is helmed by one of the most incredible dynamic directors of our time, Mr. George Tillman Jr. George is an American film producer, screenwriter, and director. George first is most notable for directing the film Soul Food. I know you guys remember that movie. Men of Honor. He's also produced the Soul Food series, also the Barbershop 2, Back in Business, and then Beauty Shop, and of course the biopic Notorious. So welcome to the Mike Muse Show, Mr. George Tillman Jr.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you. I love being here. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, man. George, you have done some incredible work that's been part of the American filmography and really the American narrative, right? And I believe that our culture that focuses on African American culture is American culture, and I think it's directors like you who have brought that to the forefront. I have become known as the host that loves to interview directors. I prefer interviewing directors actually versus the performers because the directors have the decision points, right? And so you guys have to keep the context, the tenor, the tone, the emotion of the film, and you guys really have an awareness of the narrative like no other. And so I love it. It's almost no different than when I'm interviewing politicals, right? Like governors and mayors and from the executive branch, right? It's kind of leadership decision points. And so just as a director, what does that mean to you when you talk about, owning the decisions of film?
I think this for me, I just feel like it's one of the most powerful, mediums, in terms of getting out entertainment messages and themes. I feel like as an artist, it's the one area where you need hundreds of people to make a movie. So you got to be very specific to what you want to say. What are you trying to get across in your work? For me, The Hate You Give and some of the films I've done in the past always was inspired, I guess, by family dynamics inside the community, and what is one purpose in society, and how one's purpose can sometimes change or sometimes make you better. And those are the things I guess I'm sort of attracted to as a director that I think is very important. So when it lays and it hits the audience, how are they able to walk away and take something with them? So that's always important to me when I make films.
What's interesting is I'm going to be careful not to give too much away of the film because the audience hasn't seen it yet. But I make sure to give it, to make sure you go see it this coming Friday. But the part of this film really is family. And I actually do see the story arc throughout all your other films really coming to family, in particular with Soul Food, food, right? I mean, think about meals, you think about Sundays, you think about dinners, you think about family, you think about family conversations that I have to have. And this film really represents the ecosystem of that family structure and that family dynamic. How is it that family becomes such an important part of your constitution?
I don't know. I often think about that. You know, I took a film class like back in the days in film school, and then this teacher was really trying to hit home, you know, psychologically why we're making movies. And I guess it always came to me. I had always a huge family. We always had those Sunday soul food dinners, but the community was very important. You know, we always had the storefront. Stores, the church, the community, the barbecue joints. All these guys were part of our neighborhood. We all knew each other. My grandmother would open up her doors to everybody in the neighborhood, and we'd be having everybody around our Sunday soul food dinners. So I guess that idea with family and community always stayed with me. So when I first got Angie Thomas' book, The Hate You Give, I was like, wow, this 23-year-old caught this community even today. And that's something that I wish in time of social media and all these things happening. I crave for those old days when the community and we all talked and we all was part of one another, and The Hate You Give was part of that.
Well, let's just go right there with The Hate You Give. Tell us a little bit about the context of the film.
What I love about it is just about this 16-year-old girl who navigating between these two worlds, and, you know, the inner city community that she lives in, and then the white private world, you know, school that she goes to, the white private school that she goes to. So she's constantly code switching, navigating successfully between these two worlds. And in this process, she witnessed a shooting of her best friend, Khalil. And now she has to face the facts. Should she speak, or should she speak out, or should she not? She chooses at the beginning to stay quiet because she's really worried about challenging what she is going to experience in this white world. But she starts to come to find her voice, and we kind of see how when she's finding her voice, she starts to enlighten those around her, people outside her culture, some people in her own family, and then most importantly, she begins to really find out and find her voice. That was very attractive to me as a filmmaker, because you have this young 16-year-old girl who's dealing with these huge adult obstacles, you know, being a witness to a murder and to a cop, you know, police brutality situation. So I just felt like it was a very relevant situation in terms of telling the story, but I found it to be very inspiring. It was very inspiring to me as a director.
I could definitely see the thread of family when it comes to think about The Hate You Give. The character's named Star on the film. I can see Star's development and the central character that her family played. It was almost her family was a primary character, also then a secondary character that kind of kept going because you got a chance to understand Star's constitution throughout the film, to understand the decision points that she's made. Before we get to talk about those type of elements of the film, code switching has come up a lot lately. It's become part of our popular lexicon, if you will, but African Americans have been code switching for decades, right? So this really isn't nothing new to us, but in terms of the mainstream, it's becoming to the forefront. What is the context of code switching to you, and why was it important for you to show it? Because again, directors and decision points of it, you handled it so well, right? And you gave the film gave such just great descriptions of not only just the definition, but seeing code switching in action through visualization of it.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of based off my experience. You know, we all have that experience, but you know, it's just sometimes it's about compromising yourself. You know, I always told this story and I always remembered it. You know, I remember going to this very exclusive Hollywood party, and it was only 3 or 4 African Americans there, and I was the smallest African American artist in that party, and I just remember them playing hip hop music there. You know, and my wife wanted to get up and dance, and I was like, no, I don't want white people to see us, you know, see me dancing, because that's how they think we do. You know, that's what they expect of us. I'm not going to do that. And my wife's like, just be who you are. You know, be who you are. And eventually, at the end of 20 minutes later, everybody was dancing anyway. Yeah. So again, it was like I wasn't showing a side of myself. You know, or when I'm visiting, one of the presidents of the studio, and he makes a joke, you know, like, hey, you've been in my room for 10 minutes before I came in here. Who stole my DVDs? Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, code switching for me was just trying to hold back who I was, where I come from, you know, the voice that I speak. And I just felt like at a certain time, you know, you just got to look at yourself and say, it's okay to be me. It's okay to be who I am. And that was the process, what I really connected to with with The Hate You Give is the character Star. Constantly switching. In the movie, we see her, definitely her behavior change, her vocal ability and some of her, just her vernacular change. And I really feel like sometimes you can be a little bit of both. If you both of those things, you just be who you are. And I just felt like I haven't seen that in a film. As you were talking about what is the duty as an artist in times today, I just felt like this is something that was very important that I haven't seen on film.
With that being said, I mean, I love where you're going with this, and my audience always knows that I never have any pre-planned questions. I never know where the conversation is going to land, and I have a curiosity about my subjects. And you've actually brought something to my attention I really never thought about. Because of the film and the narrative and the subject matter of the film, it's a very complicated subject matter, right?
Yeah.
It's a very uncomfortable subject matter for a lot of individuals to have a discourse on. And a lot of us, when we've seen the witnesses of the killings of African American and Latino Americans on social media, on Twitter, we had to sometimes not bring our authentic selves into the white spaces that we exist in, or even into the corporate spaces that we exist in. And so there was always like this reconciliation of how do I talk about it freely, but then also too, how do I talk about it in the constraints and the constructs of this corporate space that I'm existing in. And I think what the film has allowed to do, we haven't seen a film, at least to my knowledge, that's really highlighted this issue that we're seeing into a larger narrative of film and into story and into narrative. I almost see the film almost metaphorically as code switching, right? And so how did you think through that and the positioning of this film, knowing that it's going to be brought to the masses? I mean, the studio is supporting it like crazy. I see so many commercials on it, and it's entering the mainstream space. So how did you think that through?
Yeah, I really felt like it was sort of time, guys before me or directors beforehand, in the 70s, there was only a few African American artists or directors or writers, in the 70s or 60s, guys like Michael Schultz or Gordon Parks, those guys were out there. Sidney Poitier, they were directing, but 80% of the time they were all white, artists. And I think right now we are sort of controlling our narrative, with African American showrunners or, African American directors or people of color now, women directing. And so I think it's very important. You're going to get different visions and different point of view. For me, I felt it was very important to show what really is going on and really feel authentic and be honest. For example, in the movie with code switching, not only that, a lot of people outside of our culture was unfamiliar with the talk, with young individuals learning how to react and learning how to, conduct themselves around a police officer just so they can stay alive, or in terms of, the 10-step Black Panther program that her star father teaches her. When I was growing up, I just remember seeing the picture of Huey Newton in this chair. I didn't know who he was. I just know he was this guy with a black leather jacket, and he looked cool. And I know he was on the wall. And I was like, wow, that guy must be something important. Until I asked the question, oh yeah, this is the Black Panther that always hit with me. And these are things I felt was important to show, because that is what's really real in the environment, in our neighborhoods. Why compromise that on film?
Yeah.
So I felt that was very important.
What's interesting, you talk about the talk, and there was a couple of moments within the film that stood out to me incredibly. The talk was one, but more so kind of going beyond the talk is when the two characters are actually in the car with each other, and you see the results of what happened to one young adult who received the talk versus another young adult who didn't receive the talk, and the dynamics that the two of them had to play into existence in that really showed what happens when the talk happens and then when the talk doesn't happen. And so how did you think that decision point through in terms of framing it in that scene that way?
Yeah, and that's a really very layered and nuanced situation because, Khalil's a single parent. Star has both parents in the household, strong father figure, strong mother, goes to a private school, and she's code switching, but she exclusively definitely knows how to conduct herself in the African American community. Inside, she's black. She knows who she is, but afraid to show. But inside that, it goes deeper into the system. What is the system? And her father talks about that by using Tupac, The Hate You Give, Thug, the whole philosophy that Tupac came in. Why didn't he get to talk? Why doesn't he have a father there? And why is he dealing? And how the system is all sort of connected. So all that is sort of nuance and opening up and conversating things that has always been talked about in the African American community. But now it's time to talk about it in the mainstream, in a way, in a movie, in a context where a narrative that can be entertaining at the same time.
What I love about this too in the film, because now we can insert biases into play, because the moments that happened surrounding the talk, there was a bias that the officer used that caused a pivotal moment in the film to be transformative for both Khalil and Star and families and communities' lives when it comes to that. And the biases that we saw was when it's particular. When they're in the police department, right, and in the precinct, and all the stereotyping that existed, and all the biases that the officers actually brought to the table in their questioning. But what I love though is how you position that. The juxtaposition of that though to me was when we saw Khalil and Star engaging at a house party, just being teenagers, right, just being 13 years old, 14, 15, 16 years old, and being youthful, and sometimes law enforcement, and not just law enforcement, but people in authority, whether it's principals at a school, whether it's a teacher, they bring so much biases to the table, they can't look past the fact that these are kids, right? And these are youth, how it's handled. Talk to us about the importance of showing the youthfulness, right, and the youthful spirit in these kids where a lot of authority likes to position them in adult places and spaces. Yeah,
when I look, and it was very important for me because I look at some of the activism that's happening across the country, or, you look at the Charlotte or Ferguson. I mean, there's a lot of young people who are behind these changes or wanting to change. They're very intelligent, very smart individuals, very prideful. And I feel like that nuance was very important for me to get across because it starts with the young. You look at the Black Panther, program, look at that 10-step, program that these guys had in their late 60s. I mean, these guys were in their early 20s. And this is sort of what happened with, the Black Lives Matter and a lot of organizations that was very helpful for us throughout the movie. So I wanted to get that across, at the end of the day, these are kids and they watch Harry Potter. They talk about Harry Potter. They're only like a few years removed, from, heading into college. So these are the things that we can change. What Tupac was talking about, all these things we can give love now early or educate really early. So that was very important. But in terms of bias, like you were saying, we see that on her uncle's side, Uncle Carlos, who's a black police officer, and we see that with her dad. When she brings home her white boyfriend, who she never told her dad about, and how he sees things. So always try to show different sides and shows different nuances so the audience can be able to feel they're getting a full meal,
I'm curious about that because, here on the Mike Muse Show, we actually do present both sides. And I always tell people, just when I'm talking to my friends about how I do the work that I do and how I curate shows and how I curate conversations, it actually is more difficult to present both sides because you often have to suspend your own internal biases that you have. But then, George, you also have to suspend your own emotion, right, in order to be really fact-based. And so actually when that scene between Star and her uncle, played by the actor Common, it actually, to me, that was one of the best moments to me of the film because you show the other side. In my mind, I was asking internally, like, how difficult was it for George to actually do this scene and to make sure he got the nuance of it right, and then to make sure that it landed well?
Yeah, and I had to look within myself because, I think we all have that inside of us.
And George, really quick, just for the audience perspective, and what I'm talking about, audience, for those who haven't seen it, is there's a moment when the officer played Star's uncle began to talk to her about what cops go through when they think about the procedural steps as they approach a vehicle, as they approach a citizen or a suspect, the things they're thinking about, and essentially their own biases that they bring to the table in order for them to make sure they return home at night. And so that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I had to look deep within myself. I mean, that was a conversation that I was having with Common. We were getting into the prep and the rehearsals. And it's true. I mean, if I just look within myself, and I may not like what I see, where, I can be walking on a side street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or Chicago, And if it's a dark street at night, and if I see 2 men, 3 African-American men on the other side of the street, and they come across the street, I'm going to think they're coming after me. Why? Because it's dark and I'm only one there and they're African-American. You know what I mean? That's wrong to think that way. I would think the same way with a white guy as well, but I would think that way. And that's within ourselves. So I have to look at myself and say, we all have all these things. That's why Star confronted her dad in that situation when he bring home a white boyfriend. So, and he has to look at his daughter in a different way. She can be able to date who she like, who she feel, but how is he able to take that? So we all have that within ourselves, and I feel like it's very important to show both sides.
It is, and to me, this is why this film is so important. Not just to art, but art imitates life. Life imitates art. And art has a way of moderating social discourse and social conversation. But it shows the nuance and the complexities of the subjects, that it really just isn't a black and white issue. And in particular, if we can push through a little bit further into the mental health component and aspect of it, because we often, in particular, and people of color in our communities, don't really address mental health and the aspect of it. And I'm not saying that you drove home this narrative per se in the film, but you can feel the mental health taking root, right? In particular, Star, who has to be perfect, who has to straddle both worlds, is very indicative of a lot of individuals in America who have to straddle both worlds. And there's a point in the scene in the movie where it actually comes out when she's engaging with her best friend in a schoolyard, and you can feel that emotion that is coming through. Talk to us about the importance of mental health and what that scene was about, but then also too, how did you guys as a director on set control that emotion and control that narrative of mental health, because you guys are dealing in some very complex scenarios and situations? Yeah,
that was one of my ways of really bringing out that issue, was really illustrating and visually seeing that Star had no time to deal with her trauma. She, immediately after the shooting, she had to go to school the next day. The next day she went to the house to visit his grandmother, and she's back in school. It's a lot of times what I've felt growing up, and in my community, a lot of these issues, we didn't work out. We just got back on the saddle, and sometimes we need to work these things out. And so that's what's building within Star the whole time, as a 16-year-old going through that trauma, and dealing with Anthony Mackie's character King in as well. There's no time to heal. There's no time to get help. There's no time to work these things out. And sometimes we think we can work these things out ourselves, but it cannot. So all that was just building towards that pivotal moment with Haley at her white private school, when Haley says the wrong thing one too many times. And we see that, and we see how Star deals with that situation, where we go into the uprising at the very end of the movie. So that's something that was very, very particular and really captured in the film, that sometimes is not dealt with in our communities.
What I love about that, audience, you keep hearing me say out, what I love about that is just because this film really hit me from a multitude of levels. Just one as a black man, to always having to moderate these type of discussions when there wasn't no film to point to, always trying to give the human element aspect of it when there was no dim visualization of human emotions, right? You can describe emotion, you can emote, but it's another thing to see it. And I think that is the power of film, is seeing the visualization of it. But to me, that really speaks to what we saw Star is witness this tragic, incident of her friend being murdered at the hands of the police officer. And she has to go back to AP Calculus. She has to go back to learning Shakespeare the next day. She has to go back to AP English and reading The Catcher in the Rye, right? Without getting the mental health that she needs. But with that at the same time being said, that really goes to PTSD that happens in our community so often. So not only are we not recognizing all that's happening with it, but we're also too, as a nation and as policymakers, aren't really taking consideration what happens in a lot of our communities, the PTSD that we're experiencing, and we never get the help for it, and we never qualify it as that. And so thank you for bringing that to attention. Ladies and gentlemen, you listen to the Mike Muse Show here on Sirius XM Radio. As always, you can tweet me at I am Mike Muse, MUSSAME, to get engaged into a conversation. Also to at SXM. Stay with us. We'll be right back for more insightful conversation with the film The Hate That You Give. Black Lives Matter,
lose respect when talking to me. I wanna live in a world, safe environment for boys and our girls. Let's inspire them to get what they earn. We expiring, we dying, and you can't manifest from my urn. Gunners than we, scream, flooding the streets. Had enough of defeat from another police officer. They offering us with no punishment. The government will...
Hey, boo-boos. It's Phoebe Robinson.
And I'm Jessica Williams.
And we're the hosts of Two Dope Queens.
Brought to you by WNYC Studios.
We get real. Well, we can't say how real we get. For all we know, you might have a kid in the room or be on a car ride with your mom.
Yeah, we don't want to make it weird and upset anyone. But you really should listen to our podcast. We've got New York's best stand-up and storytellers, too. Listen on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Insight 121.
Yeah, we gon' do some things you can't relate. Yeah, cause we from a place you cannot stay. Or you can't go, or I don't know. Or back the fuck up all me. I get those goosebumps every time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I told you it was going to be a really fascinating conversation, and now also you're learning my constitution and how I think through things as we begin to moderate these really difficult social constructs of police and community dynamics and police and community relations. And there's so many things that can kind of take away from it. I have two fantastic guests joining me this afternoon in conversation with George. I have the amazing and the dynamic Keith White. You guys are already familiar with Keith White. Keith White is our local legal expert here for the Mike Muse Show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you may recall our great, fantastic conversation we had about marijuana and food and creme brulee.
Yes, all types of nice stuff.
Cannabis and creme brulee. Thank you so much, Keith, for joining and coming back to the show.
Great film.
Oh, thank you very much.
I took my 12-year-old daughter to see it.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic. And then we have Renita Francois. I think I butchered the name again.
Renita.
I don't know why that is in my head. Renita. I apologize to you. Thank you so much for joining us as well. Renita is coming to us from the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. We serve as Executive Director, really engaging in community and dynamic and partnerships. George, after the break, we were just talking about PTSD and PTSD in our communities that they have to face. There was one central character that was played by Issa Rae. Who's really was she an attorney or community?
Yeah, she's a lawyer. Yep.
She was an attorney, and she was a community development almost coordinator.
Yes.
Liaison, actually. It was probably a better word. For an organization.
Yep.
How important was that for you to bring that into the forefront of it?
I thought that was very, very important. It's a character that was in the book, and I just felt like a lot of the organizations that we were speaking with always had these lawyers who was working for no money. They could have made more money by doing, other things, but this is something that they believed in. And when I was doing the research, was speaking to a lot of people, I was like, well, how many cases do you think, this character, April Ofray, won? Probably none. But she didn't stop. She just kept pushing because she had a belief in changing the system, the belief in doing the right thing. But she saw herself in Star, possibly, especially going through law school and working her way through the system. She probably saw some things that she saw that she would like to enlighten or bring some kind of, just advice to this young girl. So she was able to become like a sort of a mentor, the way I looked at it throughout the film. From a distance, just being there, being present, because her mom don't want her to speak. Her mom don't want her to go on television. So I felt like it was a very important character, because we see a lot of people, who's out on the pavement trying to change that we don't know about. And I just felt like, Issa did a great job with that character.
She did, which is why I have Keith White here. And I think Keith White can equally do a great job in that. So ladies and gentlemen, the new Issa Rae, Mr. Keith White.
Right. Hey, I'm happy.
So Keith, we're just talking about from the legal aspect of it, and as an attorney, talk to us a little bit about the dynamics that you were able to recognize in the character in the film that was being played by Issa Rae, an attorney, in terms of how you have to deal with young adults, both who are caught up in the system, but then also two who are a witness to scenarios and making them comfortable and wanting to advocate and bring justice on behalf of their friend, a family member, or the community.
Right. So, I think that there's a couple of things to talk about. That we can have a conversation about restorative justice. But when we're talking about, and we can have a conversation about preventative justice. But in those instances where a child is harmed at the hands of a police officer, an unarmed child is harmed at the hands of a police officer, and there are other child witnesses there, I think that Issa Rae's goal and responsibility, or what she felt like her responsibility was to make sure that the process for holding this police officer and this police department accountable would be fair and it would be equitable. And the only way that you do that is that you corral witnesses, you corral statements. And so getting those statements is tough because parents, we don't want our children on the forefront of our civil rights battle. We think that that's our job, right? Mm-hmm. But oftentimes children are going to be at the forefront of our civil rights battle. We look at Brown v. Board of Ed, desegregating schools. No matter what your opinion is about that, children were the ones who were in those classrooms getting stuff thrown at them, who were being treated disproportionately terrible. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what Issa Rae's job was to do was kind of bifurcated. One, it was to try to put these children in a space where they could tell their story and give their narrative, but at the same time protect them from or put a shield over them in a way that they can tell their story and still feel safe. Mm-hmm.
Well, Keith, listening to you and your temperament, your tone, you make individuals feel comfortable and safe. But I know that's not easy to do, right? And we were just talking earlier about the mental health aspect that kind of goes into play. And I know in watching the film, there was a moment where I actually wanted Issa to go further and to be more aggressive with Star, the character, because I felt like Star needed to do it, right? And so as an adult watching this film, I'm rooting for the adult to pressure this child to really own the responsibility of that moment. And I had to ask myself that question, was that fair for me to even want to root for this fictional character? But that's very reflective of real human beings and citizens of our country today. As an attorney, how do you reconcile that?
So it depends on your framework and like your lens, right? And I think that looking at Issa Rae's character, she did that job. She did such an amazing job showing the restraint that she needed to show, because Star's character was experiencing cracks in her mental health, in my opinion, and it presented when she was faced with these white kids in school who didn't understand her trauma. And when they didn't understand her trauma, she presented. And when she presented, it looked like she was violent towards them, but she was violent towards her trauma. Mm-hmm. And I think that what Issa Rae's restraint did is her restraint said, you know what? In this moment, the thing that I want to get accomplished will not be accomplished if I keep pushing. And I think that you have to recognize that. You have to notice that. And I think that even if she had, and let me just take a step back, right? The grand jury process. Right, the grand jury process. I've put cases in the grand jury. I've defended cases in the grand jury. Right, the grand jury process is something that can be easily manipulated. And the problem is, if I wanted to indict something, if I was a prosecutor and I wanted to indict something, it'd be very easy for me to indict it. If I wanted to have something blown out of the grand jury where it wasn't indicted, it'd be very easy for me to look like I put on a presentable case. Right, and so I think that process is really governed and owned by the prosecutor's office, and it's under seal. And so there's so much that we don't know and we're not a part of, and that's not a participatory process. Mm-hmm. And so because it's not, I think that was another thing that kind of muted or quieted Issa Rae's fire. Mm-hmm.
Well, Keith, I want to ask you a follow-up question to that, and then I'm going to bring you back into the conversation, George, to understand how you gave context and nuance to that. We see so often the grand jury, as you say, it's a cloak and dagger scenario. It's a cloak and dagger situation, right? And there already is so much mistrust within the people of color and police and community dynamics and the law, right? How do you, as a lawyer, encourage your clients, people that you're advocating for, to say, no, you are needed because you could actually have an impact that could serve justice when we haven't seen justice served too often?
So I'm going to take that and flip it just a little bit. I'm going to respond to the question, but and the reason why, so I don't usually wear a suit all the time, right? So the reason why I have on a suit today is because I'm on trial now. My case is adjourned. But let me say this. The most important job that many of us, our civic responsibility that we should be performing, is jury duty. And so many times I'm in court and I'm frustrated at the amount of black people, the amount of people of color, the amount of people that are from marginalized communities who do not want to serve on jury duty. And what that does is that removes you from the pool of people that would be making these types of decisions. And so now it's a room of people. It's not a fair process because, and the thing that informs many of us not wanting to perform our civic duty of jury duty is that, we have jobs, we have kids, we have so many responsibilities. There's so much weight on us as a people, right? That we feel like I just don't have time for that. But what's happening when we don't serve in jury duty, right, is we have cases presented in a grand jury where people who aren't from our community, who don't have our lens, who don't have our framework, right, they make decisions for us. And so oftentimes, the type of clients that I have and I represent and the pro bono stuff that I do, I'm usually not telling them to testify in a grand jury. But when I'm doing civic work, when I'm speaking in my community, when I'm speaking in churches, when I'm speaking in different spaces, I'm always telling people, please serve in jury duty. Please do your civic duty.
What I'm smiling about so often is because, again, I wasn't planning on going here, but I also talk about jury duty a lot. I also talk about the impact of gentrification that's having on jury duty and jury selection because a lot of individuals who live in certain communities of color that are being gentrified are often policed and actually get caught up in the criminal justice system, but then actually are presided over jury that's reflecting a newness of the community that has no touch points with the community whatsoever, which is a problem with gentrification that we don't talk about when it comes to that.
Can I just ask it? And this was another layer of the film that I thought was incredible. There is a conversation about class gentrification that many of us are not having. And what I try to do when I'm in these spaces, I try to have white people talk about race, black people talk about class. Common's character as a police officer who was upwardly mobile, who was very well adjusted to the system, right? That's a class conversation and how he dealt with it. How did you address it in the film without obviously spoiling it? I just thought,
no. You can be my co-host, Keith.
I mean,
because I thought that was amazing.
But we were talking about gentrification, so it's a perfect segue. Jump off,
No, that all comes with, Regina Hall characters is his sister in the film. They went to Catholic school. Right. So a lot of that you can see visually by Common's house. We didn't talk about it in the movie, but in the book you will see that his wife is a lawyer. Right. Common house is near Williamson. Right. So I use the same kind of color palette for that world. So a lot of that is all classism and within the relationship between her father and Common. Right. So there's always an issue, there's always a conflict. I remember growing up, it was always he think he's better because he's living in a better neighborhood or he has a lot more. This is among family members. You know what I mean? So it becomes this little conflict within our own nuclear family. And those are the things where it don't move the narrative along in terms of the story, but it's those layers that I've tried to find. That's why Regina characters always says, we moving, we getting out of the neighborhood. And and later on we see the choices they make. Do they stay? Do they want to leave? Right. How do we build up classism, which is sometimes you got to stay.
Yeah.
Right. So those are the things that I felt what I was seeing.
Yeah.
In our communities,
Well, speaking of communities, now I want to bring in Renita into the conversation, and I promise I'm going to ask this burning question that I have for you, George. But now, Renita, we're talking about community. We're talking about gentrification. I saw you shaking your head once you brought up the word gentrification come up. You serving as executive director within the Office of Criminal Justice for the New York City's Mayor's Office. Your work particular dovetails with strategic partnerships, right? Like, what is the role of your department, and how is the City of New York dealing with community dynamics and strategic partnerships to address some of the issues that we're talking about in regards to the film?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here, first and foremost. So I deal with neighborhood safety initiatives within the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. So the mandate of our office overall is, or our motto, so to speak, is smaller, safer, fairer. And that's talking about the criminal justice system, and lightening the touch of enforcement is really what this administration is focused on. And I think the conversation that you guys were having around trauma a little bit earlier is so important to the work that I do because, we are bringing the city agencies and city partners, NYPD included, into these neighborhoods that we've identified as having historic public safety challenges and not really being able to realize the same reductions in crime that the rest of the city is experiencing. And so, when we bring city agencies into that context and when we're trying to work with NYPD in that context, the thing that we want them to understand is you're dealing with generational unaddressed trauma. And so, folks' parents have experienced this, their grandparents. We encounter people that are saying, I've lived in this neighborhood for 60 plus years. I've lived here for 50 plus years. I raised my children here, my grandchildren here. And so they're all dealing with this unprocessed trauma and the feelings that manifest from that. And so when you add that onto the generational disconnect that exists, these are different times. The young people we're dealing with now are growing up in a different time even than I grew up in, and I'm 34. And so when we get to the point of trying to understand what are the challenges that youth are facing, what are the dynamics of the family that we need to address, particularly in my work where we're focused on addressing the underlying issues that impact crime, sometimes it's very difficult to have that conversation when people experience the criminal justice system so differently, when they experience NYPD so differently, when they experience the city so differently. And so trying to really balance those things is something that we really focus on. We have an initiative that we're doing right now called Neighborhood Stat that brings, the data together with the community, together with city agency partners, for the neighborhood to really lead the conversation around what are our priorities and what do we want to see happen to address the things that we've identified as the drivers of crime. And that varies across a wide spectrum of who you're engaged with. And so oftentimes you'll hear things like, youth issues, youth programming. Those are the issues that are identified. And then we come to the meeting and where are the young people? They don't feel like this is their conversation. And so we have to bring the conversation to them and bring, law enforcement to them and say, from our portion as a city, from our side of things, we need to understand that there's a lot of unaddressed trauma here that manifests itself in different ways. We're here to listen, to acknowledge the experience of young people, to acknowledge the experience of community, and to respond to that, and not to bring in elements of our past experiences or whatever preconceived notions that folks may come into the community with, because there are times when we're dealing with people who work in a community that don't live in the community. They're not from the community. And so this is really a learning process for us as the city, a learning process for law enforcement, and with the new community policing initiatives that are going in New York City. And we're not saying that it's perfect, obviously, but we are making, I think, very big strides at bringing communities together with law enforcement in particular, to address some of these long-standing historic challenges that we see in the relationship.
That's why I really wanted you to be here in conversation with George, is because you talk about the underlying indicators and factors that happen within the film. And George, I know we can't keep you forever, but just in terms of what Renita is really addressing, there's a really important part of the film where Regina Hall's character, and you alluded to this already, is doing a dance with the father and really showing a community business owner, an owner within a community, a small business owner, an entrepreneur, and that's so often the importance of economic development and is a stronghold of our community. When you guys began to talk about whether you're in the writing room or whether you're about to on set and dealing with that, how important was that for you for the store to be a focal point of the movie?
Yeah, that was very important because there's so many community leaders who just live in the community. They don't hold an office. They got small businesses, and they're walking the streets and they know the neighborhoods. They talk to people. They just there, and that's what we felt. What Mav, played by Russell Hornsby, represented, and I really felt like in directing it, like we shot this in Atlanta and we shot this in the Cascade neighborhood in Atlanta, and that's what I was feeling when I found these locations. I wanted to feel like it was a neighborhood, and how do we, I hear so much about gentrification and so much about things are changing. What do you do to counter that? What do you do to uphold the neighborhood and uphold the community? Mav represented that. Mm-hmm. But then you have another side of Regina who wants to move. How do you move up? I mean, when I grew up, my father, we were the first black family to move in this white neighborhood. And it was a shock for me just to be around some people who are different and how they treated us. And then you think about it, I said, wow, did I get where I was because of those moves that my dad made? Or what if we would have stayed, Those are the things that I wanted to bring up that I thought was very important. At the end of the day, I think it's very important for us to continue bringing the neighborhood, keep bringing it up, keeping business there. And I just felt like this was the choice that the family ultimately going to make in the film. But these are the things that were very important to me, because I feel like, when you're dealing with a film with Star and what she represents, there's all these little nuances, there's all these little layers, it's all sort of connected to a bigger picture, and that's what we really wanted to do.
I just can't thank you enough for being such a great caretaker of culture throughout the years of your directorial that you brought to us and to America, and being such a great custodian of this conversation. It's a very difficult conversation to have in general, but then to put on the screen and to handle it the way you did was absolutely brilliant. The movie comes out this Friday. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you go see it. And if individuals want to tweet you, George, how can they reach you on Instagram or Twitter?
Yeah, it's George Tillman, _George_Tillman.
Thank you so much for everything that you've done.
I appreciate it.
Renita, so we were just talking about the complicated conversation it has. The movie presents with the storylines of criminal justice and really bringing the human narrative to it. As I have you and Keith here together, how often does the mayor's office and the division that you work in engage with individuals like Keith who are on the legal side of it? And how has it been getting all sides to the table as you launch some of the pilot programs that you were mentioning?
So for my particular work, we don't work a lot with attorneys. There are other aspects of our work, like the closed records initiatives and things that are done with the DA's office and the legal panels and defense attorneys who touch more of that world. With us, we're really focused on how do you legitimize or amplify the voice of community organizations that have been on the ground doing this work for years, unacknowledged or unsupported or unresourced. How do we bring those organizations to the table with us and really get their take on what is happening in the neighborhood, what the changes might be? Some of the public housing areas that we focus on are in neighborhoods that are fast gentrifying, like you were talking about, like Ingersoll and Fort Greene, for example. And how do we bring organizations that have been there on the ground for years together with residents to the table and city agency partners to lift up their voice? They understand the community. They've been doing this for a long time. Sometimes they are able to be present when other community members aren't because of whatever their obligations might be. So we've really been focused on how to bring that community perspective that really has longevity to it. How do we bring that to the conversation?
And with Keith, you and I, we always talk about solutions, right? And so I like to talk about what is possible. I believe we're talking about now this narrative of the holistic approach to criminal justice reform, right? And there's so many other underlying indicators. And I think the film did such a really great job of presenting the wholeness of what happens to individuals, families, communities, in different dynamics, policing, municipalities kind of coming together. As someone who's on the front lines of this, how do you think, what could be a solution, not the solution, because there never is just one solution, right? I believe in a series of solutions that help address a problem. What are some solutions you think can help in terms of to help us guide and look at the holistic approach to it, and how community dynamics can partner with the legal system and can partner with policy officials?
So I think that you can't build anything without the right tools. And I think the first thing we need to start doing is we need to start equipping police officers with the right tools. If we really want them to be partners in our communities, then the right tools are not necessarily guns and sticks and summonses. The right tools are, how do you triage someone who's in crisis, right? The right tools are training on mental health. The right tools are training on diversity, on equity. And I think that conversations and training on that is one step. I think that also looking at the most at-risk communities and start addressing their traumas, right? And I think that if we start addressing the most at-risk communities' traumas, whether it's the economic trauma of unstable or not having a stable place to live, eat, clothing, food, and shelter, right? And I think that if we start addressing those things, we start addressing education for our most marginalized communities, I think that what will happen is we'll start seeing people who are dealing with life, dealing with each other in a different way. And I think that we'll start looking at crime differently. And I think, I know we got to wrap up, but I also think it's important for us to look at in the film Khalil, right? The friend, right? And everything, how underserved he was and how marginalized he was, but how beautiful he was. She went to school with someone who had all of the training and all, this boyfriend who was trying to force her to have sex, right? And she was with this kid who was underserved, marginalized, but he was lauded as being a drug dealer, but he said, we have a lifetime ahead of us.
Yeah.
Right? He was such a beautiful character, and I think that we need to start looking at each other holistically as full, complex human beings. And when we start doing that, we'll start to process our problems differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you see why I had these three individuals in conversation to really address such a very complex issue that's needed. Renita, Francois, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing within the Office of Criminal Justice. And Keith White, thank you for all that you're doing and being on the front lines of these very important issues and advocating on behalf of those who don't have advocates, don't know how to advocate for themselves. How can people reach you, Keith?
Keith White.
On
just
Twitter,
Keith
Instagram?
White. It's on Twitter, it's Keith White, and on Instagram it's just Keith White.
Renita, how can they reach you on Twitter or your office?
You can follow the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice at Criminal Justice NYC on Twitter. And if you follow the hashtag Safe Vibrant NYC, you can check out the work that the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety is doing.
Awesome. That is our time. As always, I am Mike Muse, M-U-S and Sam E. Also, too, on SiriusXM at SXM. That's our show. Talk to you next week. Peace.
Doesn't mean the dirt won't come up. There's a fire burning up. Only thing stronger than hate is love. We need a change. Oh yeah. A song amazing grace. Won't be quiet anymore.
With the new and improved SiriusXM app, you can follow your favorite hosts on Twitter while streaming. Plus, catch shows you missed when you want with On Demand. Visit SiriusXM.com/app for more info.
Sit Down with Alfred and Chris.
A discussion of music,
movies, television.
It's like your local newspaper's art section. Is Twin Peaks more influential than the Larry Sanders Show?
Who's the best Anderson?
Paul Thomas or Wes?
It's a lifestyle show. We discuss fandom with celebrities, writers, critics,
and comedians. Where's the oldest bar in New York?
What's Spielberg's best movie? It's Sit Down with Alfred
and Chris.
Now on Thursdays at 6 p.m. East
on SiriusXM Insight 121.
And on demand.
Anytime on your SiriusXM app.
Hey, boo-boos, it's Phoebe Robinson, host of WNYC Studios' hit podcast, So Many White Guys.